So, hi again, everybody. Our second Microsoft speaker for today is Matt Farmer. Matt is a senior program manager at Microsoft who is working with Logic Apps. Prior to joining Microsoft about 12 years ago, Matt was a solution architect in the UK. And during his session today, Matt will explain the latest development in Logic Apps and their effect on the trends in the near future. So, Matt, please go ahead.
Thank you, Lex. Hope everybody can hear me okay. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. I hope you're enjoying Integrate so far. I think this is either my fourth or fifth Integrate. Always a great event to be at and always enjoy being there. Slightly different this year, but hopefully we can all still have a great event, enjoy and network and enjoy the content, except this content, which I'm just about to present, of course. I am Matt Farmer. I'm a program manager in the Logic Apps team, and I'm going to take you through a session entitled "What Our Integration Roadmap Means for You." I will apologize right now in that I have a very cheap desk and it wobbles really easily, and I will be doing a demo for a large part of this session. So if it causes motion sickness, I apologize right now. We're doing, as I said, we're doing quite a large demo in this session. It is only just gone 7 o'clock in the morning and I'm doing it all live. So if that doesn't add a certain amount of excitement to the session ahead of you, then I don't know what does. So what this session is all about is, as I said, a large part of it is going to be a demo of some of the things John was talking about in his keynote. Some big changes we've got coming to Logic Apps in the next year. And really teasing out from there what I think it means for you and what I think is going to be important for you to understand it in changes where we're at Microsoft going in the direction with our tooling. And so, you know, when I say you, who does that mean? Obviously, I suspect many of you are integration specialists, are architects and developers in integration space. But I think the thing that's going to change, and I'll come back to this later, is when you are that integration specialist, when you are that integration developer, you have a leadership role, and that leadership role within the enterprise, within your customers, is going to get only more important. And it's talking to you about and knowing about what these changes are. I think is something that when you're aware of, you can actually capitalize on in helping your customers and your enterprise to change and develop. Because what we're talking about here is really evolution of the cloud platform, evolution of tooling, based on the feedback the customer's providing as they go into those cloud journeys. As we see more and more customers moving parts of their infrastructure to the cloud, so the tooling that we're providing is evolving based upon that feedback. And it's also changing the ways in which we provision technology, where we interact with each other within the IT industry. It's all about evolution. So let's start by dipping into the Logic Apps preview, which John briefly touched on earlier on. I'm going to take you through a pretty detailed demo on how that tooling can be used, and then we'll come back and draw some points out from that. So let me switch over to hopefully that all went fine. Oh, we've got a bit of, there we go. Oh, no, there we are. Okay. So we're going to start in VS Code, and we're starting here because we believe, let's talk about Logic Apps for a second. So Logic Apps, whilst we provide Visual Studio add-in and VS Code add-in, I think what is really important to point out is we imagine when you build Logic Apps in the very near future, this is going to be the place where you come to do it, i.e. the integrated development environment, the IDE, for the vast majority of times, more than you do today. The portal is going to be a place where you can do Logic Apps development, but generally it won't be. You'll be using the IDE. Why? Well, we'll see as we go through, but it's all about developers. And it's all about that developer persona and how developers interact with technology. So let's look through what we've got here. This is the VS Code add-in. So Logic Apps does have a VS Code add-in today, but this is going to be a new and much upgraded version of that. Thing to draw your attention to right now is that we're developing this Logic Apps in a local project. So I'm doing this entirely on my developer machine. Big bit of feedback we've received from lots of customers, from lots of developers. It sounds a bit subjective, but it comes across time and time again. As being a developer in a former life, I totally get it. You want your stuff on your machine. You want to be able to take it where you want to take it. But most importantly, you don't want to have to interact with servers and things like that first. You want to be able to just do everything locally on your machine. So I'm running this, this little demo I've got on my local machine in this local project. I can provision a workflow from here, a Logic Apps workflow. I can also provision a function. I'll come back to that later. But let's jump into the file system and have a look at what we've actually got here. So ignore the red flag in the object folder. This is obviously a very pre-release piece of software, so it may have a few quirks. But if I just show you, I've got some very interesting naming for the objects within this folder. I've been super creative. So let's look at stateful 1, which is a workflow that I've created here on my box. Let's just kill that. So stateful 1 is a workflow. Now, if you've done Logic Apps development, forgiveness if you haven't, but we'll walk you through it. Logic Apps are defined with a JSON definition. So I've opened that JSON definition here, and you can see if you've done a Logic Apps development, you'll be super familiar with that setup there. But here's the first thing that's new and within VS Code is I can open the designer and run that in VS Code as well. So there'll be a little bit of compilation. I'm just going to move my Zoom window so I can see what I'm looking at. So this is a Logic App. It's run entirely on my machine, but I'm still using the Logic Apps designer just like I would in the portal. Some things to call out about this. Yes, I can add an action just like any other normal Logic App. I can browse through the actions here. But I also have a few different actions here that aren't available in normal Logic Apps. So this SQL connector, for example, is running entirely on my machine. It's connected to a SQL server running on my laptop. So I am actually just writing a SQL query. I've already set up a connection, and I am calling it from this, this action here. More on why that's important in a bit. Other things, I am using things like compose just like I would normally with a Logic App, but also I am calling a function. Now, when I call a function here, I am actually passing in the result of the SQL query, but I'm just calling this function here. The function is defined with the workflows. Why? Because we get lots and lots of feedback from customers and developers in specifically that developing a workflow to structure the organization of your API or your event that you're processing, and then being able to call into functions to do more complicated processes, to do things where maybe the Logic App tooling doesn't do it exactly the way you want it, is really important. And it mixes that skill of the developer in writing code with the accelerating their pace of work by using the Logic App to structure it. Just to show you some other features that we've got here. So I did have the SQL query defined. Now in normal Logic Apps today, you would define a connection object, and that exists within the Azure portal. What we want to do is make this as easy as possible for you to automate and deploy the work you've created. So actually the connections here are just defined in a JSON file. And so as I add other connections, they appear here too. The connection strings that they use here in the local settings file, so you can swap out those connection strings between different environments very easily. Swap out the connection string to the server. Okay, so we've got our first Logic App defined. Let's go and run that. And when I do, boom, there the terminal comes up. And hopefully what you're going to see in a few seconds, I will just bring this up a bit as I've changed my screen size to be suitable for the broadcast, but hopefully you'll see in a second. There's a live demo, so everything runs slightly slower. That's just the law of live demos. There we go. So hopefully you can see this here, which is the functions logo. Now, what is actually going on here is the Logic App workflow definition is understood by the functions runtime and compiled and run by the Azure Functions runtime. So that's how I'm running this locally on my machine. It's Logic Apps running on the Azure Functions runtime, deploying workflows locally here. As you see, I've got this set of endpoints that I've defined here, more on some of these others in a minute, that I've deployed successfully. Let's go and try them out. And again, I have to move my zoom window again. So I've got Postman here, and I've got this stateful one workflow. You can see that I'm calling a local host address, but I've still got the kind of security and SAS token that I'm passing through normally with Logic Apps. Let's call it. Now, the first thing you notice is it takes a little bit longer to run than perhaps we'd expect. There's a little bit of a cold start the first time you run it, but then the second time I run it, there we go. It speeds up. It speeds up. Again, not quite what I expect, but you know, it's the law of the demo. The screen is very small here, but hopefully you can see that we have a bunch of JSON that I'm passing back here in the result set. So my Logic App has run successfully on my local machine. I've not gone to the cloud. I've not touched anything like that. I've done it all here locally on my machine. So let's minimize that. Some other things to show you. So I have, oops, not Open Designer. Other thing is run history is preserved. So I can jump into the Logic App here. I can get the overview. I can see, make sure this is the latest one. Yeah, 1st of June. I haven't run it this morning. And I can show that run history. There we are. I can jump in and see what got passed in and out of the SQL query, for example. Just like I would a Logic App elsewhere. So I can debug this just as effectively on my local machine as I can with the tools in the cloud. One thing to point out about run history. So by default, Logic Apps has records all this information. So first thing in the morning, croaky throat. The Logic Apps records this information going in and out of each action. Now it does this by persisting this information to storage. That's great because A, you get this very detailed debug view, so you can see exactly what went in and out of each action. It's easy to do things like replaying parts of the Logic App, and it provides a lot of resilience. But there's a cost associated with that as well. So by doing all those writes to storage to save that information and make the Logic App resilient, we're also paying a compute penalty to do so. So if I go and create a new workflow, what it will ask me to do is, do I want to create a stateful workflow or a stateless workflow? And this is a new concept we're introducing as part of this preview that allows you to make that choice. What does it mean? Let's escape out of that. I have two that I've pre-created. So let's open this one. So the stateful 5, another very elaborately named Logic App, and stateless 6. So you will see that these are identical. As I drop into what the definition is, they're completely the same in how they're defined. The only difference is when I go into the workflow definition, you will see that this one is defined with a kind of stateless. So what stateless means is that the Logic App runs without persisting that data out. we're doing this to mean that the logic app executes as fast as we possibly can. So in scenarios like request response or streaming scenarios where absolute resilience of what you have created isn't as important as lower latency, the stateless model for logic apps gives you the choice to use the same definition model, the same, same low code, high productivity tool set, but it gives you a choice in how the actual workflow executes based on your scenario. I'm going to demonstrate that to you in a second, but first, just going back to the add-in. Now, there's a couple of things I could do here. So having this defined as a local project, what I could do is take all the files in the project here, all as a batch, and deploy those as a check-in into my source control environment, etc. Derek's session that he's got, I think later on today, will take you through some more details about how doing that. So please make sure you check that out. The other thing I could do here is deploy to an app. I could deploy it up to Azure. So if I select my subscription, I could select an app that I provisioned or create a new one. And then I could deploy that. Now, I'm not going to do that because it takes a few minutes or a few seconds, but I've one I prepared earlier. So let's jump across to that. So this is an app that I've already pre-provisioned in Azure. Now, you'll notice that I have the Workflows tab on the left-hand nav. And here are the two workflows I was talking about there, Stateful 5 and Stateless 6. And you'll see they have a state for stateful or statelessness. When I jump in, I can do things that I would normally do today with the Logic Apps Designer. So I can look at the code view, or I can look at the designer. It's pre-release software. Anything can happen. Don't worry, we're working on it. There we go, it came up. It just had to get a little warm. So I have the Logic App provisioned here as well. So just to prove they are actually running up in the cloud, let's jump back to Postman. And I can call these from here. So you see that the URL is the azurewebsites.net URL. The app is there waiting. So I'm going to just call this. There we go. So I got the results back. Let's give it a chance to warm up. Okay, so 800 milliseconds. That's the stateful model. I've got exactly the same logic app defined in the stateless model. So let's run that a few times. All right. So that's come in at just over 200 milliseconds. And the stateful one was around 800 milliseconds. So what we're seeing is the difference between the two is roughly 4x at the moment, 4 times faster to run a stateless model. Now, these logic apps obviously have been specially created to highlight some of these differences at the moment. Obviously, if you're calling out to third-party services and things like that, that's something we can't control, but just to highlight the difference in execution speed. So, and this is obviously pre-release, so this will continue to improve over the next few months, but to give you an idea of the difference between the two. So stateless and stateful. It's back to VS Code. Final thing that I just want to quickly show you, and it's not going to be able to completely show you because I just realized this morning there's something missing from the demo, but I will show you, and Derek's going to give you more detail on this later. Oh, whoops. You'll see here I have a Docker file configured within my application. Now, because we're running on the Azure Functions runtime, we can use all the features of that already exist, like the ability to deploy to a container. So I absolutely can take my Logic Apps here and deploy to a container. If I run it here, I can do that. Now, this is a bit that's not going to work because I realized this morning we updated security and I can't call the Logic App yet, but just to prove it does work, I'm provisioning my Docker file that contains all of these. And then I am able to call the Logic Apps wherever they are, wherever I take that Docker file. So not just on my local machine, obviously, but to Kubernetes clusters and other Docker compliant services wherever they are. Okay, So that was the demo, 7 o'clock in the morning. Other than the Docker thing, which I only realized 10 minutes ago, I think we did okay, but I'll wait for your Q&A to see whether that's the case. Let's jump back into the PowerPoint deck. Okay. So that was a reasonably complicated demo with lots and lots of features in. So you may just be, you know, if you looked away for 1 minute, you may be asking yourself, what did I just watch? So let's summarize what you had there. So what you just saw was me developing Logic Apps locally on my developer machine. Those Logic Apps compiled to run on the Azure Functions runtime using connectors. I forgot something. Let's just quickly show you. It's early in the morning, you know. I'm just going to quickly show you the thing that I forgot to show you. So this is live, you know it's live. Right, so if I open this Logic App here, I knew I'd forgotten something. Just to prove that you can actually, as part of this, we do have the connectors, we have all the built-in ones. So the built-in ones are running locally on the runtime here on my machine. Now, for things like the SQL connection, that's great because I can then, when I deploy it elsewhere, I could just connect to SQL in the same native way without actually reaching out to the internet. But what you're likely to want to do as well, one of the great bits of Logic Apps is the SaaS connectors. We have over 300 that you can connect to services everywhere. Now, even if you're running locally on your machine, you might still want to call out to Office 365 or Salesforce or Dynamics. You can do that. That is supported entirely. So if I just go in and select Outlook, for example, I can go down and choose the, wow, there's a lot of actions in Outlook. I can choose the send email action. I can start writing an email here. Probably should use it with real words rather than just typing. But those connectors are all supported within this runtime. So you can absolutely build hybrid flows that connect across your on-prem assets and into the cloud, into SaaS. Right, let's go back to the presentation. Glad I remembered that. Okay, start again. I was developing Logic Apps locally on my developer machine. Logic Apps are running on the Azure Functions runtime. I'm using connectors running locally and running in the cloud. I've got the choice of the stateful or stateless operating mode. Based upon your use case, what's most appropriate, so you have the freedom to choose. Better integration with DevOps, so we can take those files in that file system, we can push that to your developer environment, push that to your DevOps pipeline very easily. Again, Derek's got a demo with more details on some of that. Didn't show this, but better integration with Azure Monitor. So App Insights specifically is coming. I know that's a top request. This allows us to make those changes and integrate that much more easily. So that will be part of what we ship. And again, I can deploy to Azure like I did, or I can deploy to a Docker container and then run it wherever that Docker container runs. So you may be asking yourself, that sounds fun, Matt. Can I play with that? So private preview is available now. The private preview release is what I just showed you. We will be updating that, but it is available now. However, you can use the link to join the waitlist. I say waitlist because this has been very popular so far. And what we want to do is just make sure we give people the right level of management in doing it. But if you're interested and you want to try out, add yourself to the waitlist and just be aware that places are limited, and please bear with us, but we will communicate and we will get back to you. If you're saying, well, you know, what does this mean for getting more real about when this goes live? We're expecting public preview coming later this year, exact timing to be decided. So the kind of rubric of this session was, you know, what it means for you with our integration roadmap. So from what I've shown you, what does it actually all mean? Hopefully you got, with the focus on VS Code and the focus on being where the developer is on their dev box, that a huge part of what we're trying to achieve with the changes we're making, and something we see across different teams in Azure and Azure Compute, is making sure that we put developers at the center of everything we do. I think it's a very interesting piece, as I was saying at the beginning, for those of us who are perhaps been integration architects and who have done integration specialist roles. Because what's really changing is that integration technology, and I suspect John talked about this in his session, is very much overlapping with what just normal developers do. They are now, integration is development. And as someone who's a specialist in integration, what you're probably doing now is, rather than having what you do as a separate set of technology, you're really just helping developers to find the right path in deploying a project that sounds and looks very much like we would consider a traditional integration project, because all those projects at enterprise level are integration projects, but there are developers developing them. I mean, if you think about the technology that's changed, integration space is one that adopted the idea of using things like low-code tools. So look at BizTalk. Much apps traditional software development did, but that is changing because the whole world realizes that there is too much development work to do and we need to accelerate. So developers are going to stay at that center. And I think from an integration point of view, it's all about how you help those developers be successful, how you bring your knowledge of the way in which integration projects run to the whole of software development. And things like having our Logic Apps tooling very much centered on Visual Studio, on VS Code, is absolutely part of that piece. Obviously, this picture, there's no, it's no excuse or no, it's entirely deliberate that this is a ship containing containers. The cloud everywhere, being able to deploy the same kind of concepts and the same kind of, approach to building applications that the cloud has taught us, but doing it everywhere is absolutely something that's only going to continue. You probably heard John talk about Azure Arc, which is work Microsoft's doing, and I think Mikkel has a session tomorrow. I would highly recommend you check out that. But you saw in my demo, we now have the ability to take Logic Apps and deploy it to a container. And one of the pieces of feedback we get from customers an awful lot is that they are identifying new scenarios, new hybrid scenarios, where they want the same way of building applications as they've learned in the cloud, but they want to do it wherever their compute is, like on a ship, like in the middle of the desert. Or maybe something not as extreme, like in a dedicated server within a store. The ability to do that is something everybody is very focused on in the Microsoft team. And I think you're going to see that in the technology we provide very soon. So it means you can change how you're thinking about when you're talking to customers about designing solutions, about designing how to solve problems. You're going to have more choice and flexibility in how you solve those things with the same technology patterns that you have used in the cloud. Final one. Anybody who puts no limits in a technology presentation, like I have here, is a flat out liar, because we all know there's no such thing as no limits with technology. So it doesn't sound as good, but let's say less limits. And this is something we've still got to work on. This is something that will evolve over time, but giving you technology that has less limitations on things like throughput and scale and the way you deploy it, again, is a trend we're seeing, and I think something you're going to see happening over time as things like the background technology changes and standardizes. And let's take in the developer piece. Developers want to be able to do this stuff without having to learn lots and lots of different technology limitations and settings. So we're not quite there yet. There's stuff to do. There's definitely changes to be made, but I think you're also going to see that you don't have to spend quite as much time worrying about the individual foibles, so to speak, of each technology. There's going to be more standardization and less concern about the limitations of those technologies in different scenarios. And what you saw in what I just presented there in my demo about giving you connectors that are running in proc, that being able to choose different technology choices to how you deploy them, which means you can tailor those technology choices based on your performance characteristics, things like stateless and stateful, give you that, move logic apps forward and remove some of those limitations you have today. So I'm just doing a time check. So let's just summarize what I've talked about. Hopefully you enjoyed the demo earlier, and just to summarize before I go into my points about when that's going to be available, private preview, I showed the link, I think John did earlier, public preview later, but we'd really appreciate your feedback and thoughts on that. So feedback in the Q&A and in the lounge as well. But the points I'm making about that demo, just summarize: developers at the center. What you do and how you integrate with developers is changing, and integration technology is just becoming developer technology. So you as integration specialists are going to be at the vanguard of bringing those changes in the way in which you develop applications into developers as a whole. The cloud everywhere. So, new hybrid use cases emerge, and you have the ability to take your cloud technology and deploy them wherever those new use cases emerge with things like containers. And then no limits, less limits, less specialization, less specific patterns and edge cases based on performance characteristics of what you're deploying. And because of that, easily available patterns for doing things like scale. And again, these things aren't always today. This is about roadmap, but this is where I think we will be moving over the next year. Okay. I couldn't go through an Integrate event without putting my scary photo, which I've managed to get into every presentation for the last 3 years at Integrate. So here it is. We're going to move over to Q&A, I believe. I'm not quite exactly sure how that works, but I will work it out. Thank you for listening, for those of you on the call. Appreciate your feedback, and let's jump over to the Q&A. Thanks.
Yeah, there's an awesome session, Matt, and it certainly made quite some impact to the audience. Indeed, when you just move over to the browser where you have the Q&A, you'll see that at least when you have refreshed the page, yeah, it's not even necessary indeed. Next you can go to Q&A, and under accepted, there's quite a bunch of good questions.
Okay, let me have a look. I will scroll up. There we go, because I assume that's the people who asked. The people who asked it. Bernard has asked, when will we see logic apps with geo redundancy and failover? My desk is going to get super wobbly. I apologize. So, Bernard, I think that's a very good question. You can set it up today, but it requires a fair amount of manual intervention and doing things. So for example, you could set 2 ICEs up with API Management Premium in front of them, with Premium doing that load balancing for you. Now that is obviously not a cheap option. So that it's possible, but I would suggest that what we're going to do, one of the things that perhaps I didn't call out very explicitly in my session, I thought I had a bullet point, but obviously I didn't, is, what are we going to do with our existing products, existing logic apps and ICE? Now we have the changes that I showed in that demo. And the answer is we haven't completely got to a point where we're going to share that with everybody, but we will. So I think what will come is more details on that stuff slightly later this year when we've completely worked that story out, and things like geo redundancy and failover in that model, in the pattern we're providing, are going to be easier and less expensive. Fingers crossed, no absolute promises, but they should be. So we'll be able to talk more about that today. I think if you've got a customer that needs to do that right now, then let's talk about potential architecture. But it might be you do this architecture now, and then maybe we slightly tweak it in the future to lower costs or give more features, something like that. Hopefully that answers your question. Andy Norris asked, will there be investment going forward with tooling in Visual Studio rather than VS Code? Yes, there absolutely will. There were some technical reasons why we decided to choose implementing the demo that you just saw, the changes that you just saw in VS Code first, and the choice was, let's make it work completely in one IDE, and then we'll go after the other. So we will get there. Just bear with us. I think that, you know, it was important to get something complete and working and show, rather than take longer to do both at the same time. There is a little bit of difference in the way the technologies work under the hood there. So we'll get to it. Designer experience in VS Code is similar to Visual Studio and the browser. The design is built in React, if I recall correctly. There's a whole bunch of different libraries there, but I believe React is one of them, Stiffjan. There are some changes to Designer coming. I don't know if Derek's touching on that in his session, but the underlying technology to implement it, I mean, I'd be interested to know your thoughts on what needs to change there. I think it's more about what's the experience we're providing. But I think if there's a technology reason you think we should change, then I'm all ears. Let me know what you think. What's the cost running locally using VS Code, Rexon? There is no cost running VS Code locally. The only cost would be, well, let me work that back. At the moment, there is no cost running locally. What we haven't completely worked out yet and completely revealed is exactly what the cost will be for running it locally if, for example, you move it to your own servers. There will likely be a cost for that. Exactly what it is, don't know right yet, but we will share that when we get nearer the time. There'll be additional features and things like that. If you were to run this locally from your dev box, if you were to connect to the cloud connectors, one thing we have to do is make sure, you know, somebody doesn't then go and provision 1 million connections to something without paying a cost. So there will be a cost for using the SaaS connectors. Again, details to be shared. But right now, if you just run it locally on your developer machine for testing, there's no cost in preview. Any insights in which connectors will be available on-prem? We've seen SQL and functions, assuming also files and others are coming. Yes, we're going to continue to add to them, Elder. In the preview we have now, we also have Service Bus and Event Hubs, but there will be others added as well running in proc. Will all connectors be able to run locally, or are there limitations? Yeah, we won't be running, for example, we will only be running connectors locally if it makes sense. So it would make no sense to run a Dynamics 365 connector locally because you've always got to go out to the cloud. So generally the answer is if it's a SaaS service, we won't be building one, but others we are taking them on a kind of a priority order based on which ones are there. Business Rules Engine in the roadmap, probably more a question for John. I think we had some ideas as part of the migration work announced this morning on how Business Rules Engine might be supported. I don't have the latest on that, so I would ask Valerie in her session, which I think is coming up in an hour or two, exactly what the plan is on that. Gustavo, what are the extensions that you used on VS Code for this demo? Well, they're not available for you right now. They're available as part of the private preview. So when we actually, I assume this is what you mean, the kind of add-in. When we release this, that'll all be shared and available. Is it possible to resubmit, retry the Logic App run locally from run history? Yes, it is. I'm not going to do that now, Nilesh, but yes, you can. Can the stateless stateful be set on parameters depending on the environment? That is a very good question, Jerry. I would expect so. I haven't done it yet. So if it doesn't work, then there might be a fundamental reason, but I don't think that is because, again, we're just interpreting the workflow definition as you create it. So there's a small number of actions at this point that aren't supported in the stateless model. I believe 4 each is not at the moment, but we're working on some of those things. So yes, that should work. Can you see if a stateless workflow has been run? Yes, you can, Anders. You just don't get the full run history. Does stateless Logic Apps support resubmit? A good question. I don't believe you can resubmit. Oh, that's a good question. Yes, I believe you can because you can resubmit the trigger, but what you can't do is see the run history. Sorry, not the run history. The steps in the Logic App. Is stateless cheaper compared to stateful? Not at this point. Again, we haven't shared details and haven't completely locked on that. Pieth. Thanks, Andy Norris. Big step forward. Good stuff. Is there a way to completely export the API connectors, configuration, and properties? Usually they come with very limited information in ARM templates. Yes, I mean, we're storing in the config of the app I created, so that in the file history, all the config is there. So yes, you can export that. What are the differences between running Logic Apps in ICE and running Logic Apps in Function Apps? They're not really something to compare at this point, Eric. ICE is GA and available. This is a change to runtime. We will also have changes for the way in which you interact with ICE. We're working on what they are. We're not quite ready yet to completely tell you everything about that, but that will be something we address. Just checking on time. What about tracked properties featured today in Logic Apps? Would that be available or on Logic App running in Azure Function? I'll be honest, Rohit, I can't remember, but I don't see any reason why not. That should be. Bernard, I've got your question already. I'm all right in thinking the stateful workflow would support the long-running transaction capabilities of Logic Apps as current. How does stateless interact with functions 10-minute execution deadline? I think the answer there, Ricardo, is it's not really designed for that scenario. It's designed for scenarios which are much faster request response kind of scenarios. So it's I think if you're looking at something running that long, there's no need to use stateless because there's no benefit if you're looking at a 10-minute time window. But I'm happy to be persuaded otherwise if we want to have a chat about that. How data will be persisted local on Docker container for the new version of Logic Apps? At the moment, we're using the Azure Storage Emulator. We are looking at exactly how, when we get nearer to public preview, you do that because the storage emulator isn't really an answer, but for now, that's what it uses. Dan said, if Logic Apps are compiled and running on the functions runtime, can I use a C# snippet in my Logic App rather than calling out to a separate function? This would be very much like the, we had the inline functions feature available now. It still only supports JavaScript, but I think we're working on how that can be more fully featured. So watch this space on that one, but good idea, of course. Can you please share details on stateless and stateful in case histories of Logic Apps? Yeah, in the run history, yes, we can certainly look at how that was defined. That's a good call, something we should look at. I think we had it in the when you're deploying the portal, but yes, not in the run history. Dan Krantz has enterprise integration pack for Logic Apps currently VS 2015. Yes, we can expect the enterprise integration pack for 2019. Exactly when, we are working on it, but I totally understand the pain there. Keep asking all the presenters today about that one and remind them. But yeah, I appreciate your pain. We're well aware of it. We're working on how we can address it for you as soon as possible. Integration count, can it run locally as well? We haven't completely locked on how that will work, but I think that's likely yes, Jorgen. Again, TBD. Vivek, is this available as preview now? You can sign up for the private preview. We are not in public preview yet. For those who aren't familiar with the difference, private preview is still very much, we share it with a limited number of customers. We ask for their feedback. None of those customers are likely to be using in anything like a production scenario, and you certainly shouldn't do that without our support. It's really designed there for feedback on the technology. We will go to public preview later this year, suspect. No promises on that, but that's what we aim to do, and that's when it'll be more publicly available. Mohammed, does this mean we have full capabilities of Logic Apps locally and can be hosted on-prem and does not require any cloud subscription? Again, exact billing construct and things like that are TBD, but the idea is you can take Logic Apps and run it wherever you wish. There may be constraints exactly on that based on the way in which the billing model comes out nearer the time. What are the functions of runtime that's supported for the Logic Apps runtime, such as Next Core, .NET Framework, .NET Core, sorry, .NET Framework, it's .NET Core. Resubmit from actions status on that. No update on that right now, Jorgen, but we know that's a high priority. I think obviously we've been working on kind of a big package of changes. Some of the changes that customers have asked for, very much ones that are kind of developer focused like that, and things like step into are ones we want to do. And I think that fits within a similar bucket because it gives us, it's a similar piece of work. Thanks, Dan, for pointing the link. Pricing model when Logic Apps is running on functions runtime in a container on hardware. We haven't locked on that yet. We'll share details on that when we have. I wouldn't make too many assumptions right now because it's just too early. We wanted to give you the early view, but we can't give you the pricing details right now. Can stateless used to hide data? I haven't really thought of it in that context, Pieth. I haven't thought about it enough to give you an idea, but there are ways to protect data within the Logic app. I'd probably look at those models rather than that. Does this change the pricing of ICE, Jonas? Not right now. I think as this technology gets closer to generally available, then there'll be more information we share with you about things like ICE and Logic Apps as they are today. Is the stateless capability backward compatible with pre-built Logic Apps? Again, I think what we haven't done is completely worked out the compatibility with existing stuff yet. I don't see any reason why it wouldn't, as it's just an additional property, but I'm not going to make any promises right now until we've done the work of working that through.
Yeah, Matt, I'm aware there are still a couple of questions.
That's all right, no problem. I thought I'll probably keep going until you told me to stop. So.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. It's being pushed from my side as well.
No problem, no problem. Well, I hope, I apologize for those whose questions I haven't quite got to, but you can always reach out to me in the lobby. I hope this presentation was useful and interesting, and the Q&A was useful as well. So okay. Thanks, Lex.
Yeah, sure, you're very welcome. And you can still access the Q&A also when the session is closed. So you still can take the question from there.
Thank you.
Fantastic, Matt. Thanks a lot.
Covey.co